We always start any presentation on air quality by explaining why we're doing anything on air quality. I don't suppose people really need reminding of this because it's in the press plenty, but ultimately air pollution is a serious risk to public health. You can see there what those risks are. But, I mean, this is something that's clearly been going up the agenda quite significantly. There's a huge amount, there's growing pressure at national level and locally for this to be taken a lot more seriously than it has been done thus far. For a lot of the pollutants we're talking about, road traffic is, by and large, the most significant contributor to those pollutants. So that's why we are intervening in this area. What's happening at a national level? Well, we've just summarised a couple of documents here that if anyone cares to go and read them, they're welcome to. But there's a clean air strategy we published at the start of the year. That's looking across the piece at the long term at all the different pollutants. So the key ones are listed there. Particulate matter is a real big challenge. That obviously comes out of exhausts. It also comes off tyres and brakes. And it has a really significant impact on health. There's others listed there as well. The Road to Zero strategy is the government's sort of medium to long-term plan for transitioning away from combustion engine vehicles entirely and towards low and zero emission vehicles. And obviously there's lots being done in that space now, but the sort of ambition over the longer term is that we move entirely into that space. And then I'm here to talk a bit more in a bit more detail about the last thing there, which is the plan to tackle roadside nitrogen dioxide concentrations. So nitrogen dioxide is the one pollutant where we are currently breaching legal levels. We have been breaching those levels for quite some time. And the government has been taken to court on a number of occasions in relation to that. And as a result of that, we've published a series of evolving plans setting out what action we're going to take. So we published a plan in 2015 and a subsequent plan in 2017 setting out how we're going to take action on nitrogen dioxide. Now, the important thing to understand with nitrogen dioxide is that the legal structures in which we operate are very rigid. We have to achieve compliance with these legal limits in the shortest time possible, and that is an absolute requirement. It is not a proportionate requirement. By that I mean we have to take all steps necessary to achieve it, and that we need to do what we can to mitigate the impacts of that, but ultimately we need to find a way of bringing down nitrogen dioxide levels as quickly as we can. And that is the sort of guiding principle of all the work we're taking. But that also clearly creates some very significant tensions because it means we have to take some rather difficult decisions which can have an impact on quite a few people. The other key point to note, and mentioning just now local authorities, I mean, ultimately, air pollution is a local issue as much as a national one, and we find huge variation in terms of pollution levels on individual streets. So you can have one street that is well above the legal limit and you can go around the corner and find that there's not a problem. So we work with local authorities to identify what needs to be done, and we fund them to develop plans, and we fund them to implement measures, and we also fund them to help businesses and individuals in areas affected to adjust to those. So when we're working with local authorities, they have to set out plans to look at what they're going to do to achieve compliance with legal limits as quickly as possible. One of the things they have to look at is a clean air zone. Now, the clean air zone as a concept is frankly modelled reasonably closely on the ultra-low emission zone in London. As I say, there are some differences, but there are quite a lot of similarities. So when a local authority is looking at the options it needs to consider, one of those has to be a clean air zone. And that is because that is the thing that we have identified that would meet our legal objectives and at a national level. So by that I mean, as I said, we have to achieve compliance as quickly as possible, and the sort of technical work we've done has suggested that some sort of charging zone is the easiest or most definitive way of achieving that. However, we ask local authorities to look very closely at alternatives because we appreciate the impact that that kind of measure has on people, and so we encourage and work with them to see whether or not there are other things they can do to avoid having to take a measure like that. But the key test is that anything else they do has to achieve compliance as quickly as the alternative, which would be a charging zone. If it doesn't, then they need to go back and look at charging, and that is a challenging tension, and it's something that we work through with local authorities. And just, obviously we expect, and Birmingham's an example here, local authorities to engage on their proposals. They would have to do broader public engagement as they develop their plans, and in the event that they do a clean air zone, they have to do a statutory public consultation on those plans. So a clean air zone, I mean, this is a difference between London and the national approach, is that we have different bands of clean air zones. So obviously in London, the approach is that all vehicles, aside from taxis, are subject to the clean air zone. The national approach is that you have different bands, but both taxis and PHVs are liable in all those bands. So taxis are treated the same as PHVs. But for the purposes of your trade, I think these bans are not particularly of interest because you are affected by all of them. But what is consistent is that taxis and PHVs are implicated. At the bottom there, you've got the minimum requirements. So it's Euro 6 diesel, so that's any vehicle registered within the last 3 years or so. Or petrol is Euro 4, so that could be vehicles up to 13 or 14 years of age. Clearly, local authorities can, and we, in some cases, do propose alternative measures either alongside a charging zone or instead of one around licensing. So they may choose to put in place some sort of licensing requirements should they wish, and we need to look with them at what the impacts of that would be. But just looking at a clean air zone, you can drive certainly older petrol vehicles and diesel vehicles. They would be the last 3 or so years that they've been registered. So at a national level, as I say, we're working with quite a few local authorities. The ones to be aware of in the shorter term are Leeds and Birmingham. Both of them will be introducing a clean air zone in the middle of next year. So that is definitely happening. They will apply to all vehicles. They've got different charge levels, and you can find out more about those if you go on their websites. As I said, we've provided both of those authorities with significant sums of money, both to implement those zones, but also to help with mitigating the impacts of those businesses impacted by those zones. By that I mean they've put in place support schemes to help people upgrade their vehicles and through grants and loans and things like that. So that's an approach we will be taking with all the local authorities we work with. Other areas that you should be aware of where they're looking closely at clean air zones as a potential are Bath, Sheffield and Rotherham, Newcastle and Gateshead, Bristol, Coventry is possibly an area, and if those areas are potentially going to introduce them towards the latter end of next year. And then in 2021, we've got another bunch of local authorities considering this, including Leicester, Liverpool and Portsmouth. So none of those are definite, but it is certainly a possibility, and we're working through that with those local authorities as we speak. So just briefly on the sort of funding behind this. So we've got about £500 million that we to support this programme. That money is to do two things. One is to implement whatever a local authority has identified. So, for example, if they're doing a clean air zone, we give them money to put up cameras and that kind of thing. And then what we call a clean air fund, which is we've actually got a bit more money than that now. So it's about £250 million to help local authorities with support businesses and individuals adjust to those impacts. A few examples of what we've got for clean air zones. We've got support in Birmingham for Hackney carriage support and PHV upgrades. Ditto in Leeds, we've got support for taxis and private hire vehicles. I have to say, in fact, most of the money that we've given out so far from that £250 million has focused on the taxi and PHV trade. So, I mean, as two sectors, you will be significant beneficiaries of that money. I'm not saying that makes it easy, but it's a sum of money that we have and that we are trying to target in the best possible way to support those most impacted. Nottingham and Southampton are not putting in place clean air zones. They were able to establish that they could do other things and didn't need to put in place a clean air zone. So, for example, in Nottingham, they did a lot with the buses, which are also a significant contributor to poor air quality. And they've made some taxi licensing changes, which doubtless people in the room will be aware of, and likewise with Southampton. And as I say, we've provided funding in both those cases to help with that. Very briefly to finish, I'm going to touch on our database. So obviously, in order to set these clean air zones up, we need to be able to identify private hire vehicles and taxis and distinguish between them and any other vehicle. So we have put some regulations which came into force in May of this year, which requires all licensed authorities to provide information about the taxis and private hire vehicles licensed in their area. Now, we have been very specific in that legislation that data is, I'll come on to what the fields of data are in a second, but it's for use specifically for the purpose of a clean air zone and nothing else. So as things stand, that data has very defined use, and it is so that where a local authority, for example, is putting in place if I went back a few slides, a category D clean air zone, which also charges cars, they need to, or any other zone, they need to be able to tell whether or not it's a taxi or not that is entering the area, and that's what the purpose of that is. The data points that we will be asking local authorities to provide us with are listed there. I honestly don't understand what the upload mechanism bit is talking about, so I won't go into that at all, but basically it's different formats of data that they can supply it. And they can do so, they will have to provide us with this data at least weekly, and that could be more frequently if they wish to, so on a daily basis, for example. So we're in the process of developing this system, and we've started working with licensing authorities to get that data from them with the intention that we have a pretty comprehensive database, central database on licensed taxis and PHVs by the middle of next year, which is, as I said, when Birmingham and Leeds will be going live. That's all I wanted to talk about, but obviously happy to take questions either now or I don't know how you prefer to have it. I can sit on the panel. Thank you.